Truth was repeatedly sold by various slave owners and was physically and sexually abused. Eventually, she married a man named Thomas and had 3 children named Peter, Elizabeth, and Sophia. John Dumont, Truth's slave owner, had promised to free her, but he never did, so she decided to flee with her youngest daughter, Sophia. After arriving at Kingston, New York, Sojourner Truth had found hope in religion. She joined a Methodist community that had similar ideals to hers. Religion had greatly influenced her, so she left New York in order to share her message with others. Even though she was illiterate, she was an amazing orator and spoke to crowds about biblical references and her experiences as a slave. She is most known for her speech. Sojourner Truth demonstrated her courage as she went through America advocating for abolition and women's rights, even in the most hostile regions that responded to her with violence. Her activism was so well recognized that she was invited to meet President Abraham Lincoln. Sojourner Truth was an outspoken critic who was not afraid to fight for the rights of African Americans and women in a confrontational society.
At the age of 12, I began to study education in Boston, which is when I noticed that mentally ill patients and prisoners were living in very harsh living conditions. Many people at this time did not seem to care about these poor people just trying to improve their lives. However, that is when I came in and decided to give them a solution that they were to die for. Except they didn't actually die for it, I'm just a good person. I established 32 hospitals around the United States and began the prison reform to give mentally ill patients and prisoners better living conditions. I also served as a nurse in many wars. Because of my efforts, there are now many mental asylums around the United States. Without my research, many mentally ill patients may still be living in harsh conditions. My work as a nurse has greatly improved these conditions for all.
American journalist Nellie Bly and her editors became interested in insane asylums and the treatment among the patients who were admitted. She was eager to capture the truth of the asylums, and the only way to do so was to become a patient herself. One day she stayed the night at a boarding house and pretended to be afraid of everything. Members of the boarding house noticed her unusual behavior and called the police. She was brought to a hospital, and the doctors ultimately decided to admit her to the Blackwell Island Asylum. During her stay at the asylum, she observed the different behaviors of the women and realized that many of them were in fact very sane. She documented the cold showers she was forced to take, as well as the rotting meat which was served to her and her fellow asylum patients. In her later documents that she published, she exposed the harsh conditions in which the asylum patients endured. These stories made their way to the grand jury, where they created a series of changes that would be implemented into these asylums. $1 million was added to the asylum's budget in efforts to improve the treatments of the patients who attended these asylums. Nellie Bly became a popular reformer who was one of the first women to take the role of exposing such an institution.
Okay, let's talk about Colonel Ruby Grace Bradley. She knew that she wanted something more, so she decided to pursue her passion in nursing. Enjoying every second of her new education in nursing, she eventually graduated from Philadelphia General Hospital School of Nursing in 1933 and went to work at Walter Reed General Hospital in Washington, D.C. She loved nursing so much that she took it a step further. In October of 1934, she joined the U.S. Army Nurse Corps as a surgical nurse with the relative rank of second lieutenant. She was reassigned as head nurse at Camp John Hay on the Philippine island of Luzon. This would be where Colonel Ruby Bradley would hear of the horrendous attack of Pearl Harbor, not too far from where she was stationed. A couple of hours after the attack, the Japanese continued to bomb more American camps and military bases around the Philippines, including Camp John Hay, where she was stationed. Eventually captured by the tyrannical Japanese, Bradley spent the rest of the war as a POW in 3 different prison camps. No matter which camp she was at, she always made it a point to care for the people around her. Despite terrible living and working conditions, this angel in fatigue would take some of the food she had been given for her own nourishment and instead would feed it to the hungry children. She was even able to use the excess space in her uniform that she gained from losing weight to smuggle surgical material into the POW camp. She made it a very important point to help whoever she could, whenever she could, conducting 230 surgeries and delivering 13 babies. She was also very resourceful. Now, it is very important to keep in mind that she was imprisoned. She was a prisoner of war, working with little to no supplies, living in the worst conditions, living and working conditions that anyone could possibly imagine. Yet she still managed to save hundreds of lives. Soon after liberation and recovery from her imprisonment, she came back for more in the Korean War, serving as chief nurse of the 171st Evacuation Hospital in the war. Additionally, during the Chinese counteroffensive, she refused to leave until she had loaded the wounded onto a plane, even though she was surrounded by 100,000 Chinese soldiers. She was the last person on the plane, and she watched the ambulance explode behind her. She was an absolute heroine during America's wartime and long after.